Emily and I were eating breakfast when Lori walked into the kitchen, humming a pop tune I didn't know. She was wearing a pink velour tracksuit and carrying a gym bag with work clothes in it. "Do you have time for a snack?" I asked. "No," she replied. "I'm already late for practice. I'll grab a snack when I get to the paper." "I'll see you tonight," she added, waving cheerfully. As she turned to leave, my gaze was caught by the glint of the juicy logo on her sweatpants. I smirked at Emily and shook my head. My daughter only rolled her eyes. As we got into the car to start the drive to the university, Emily reached over and turned off the news on the radio. "Daddy," she said, "you have to do something about Mom. It's embarrassing that she dresses like a teenager all the time." Shit, I thought to myself. What am I going to say to that? The truth was that often Lori's clothes would be more appropriate on a college student than a 40-year-old woman. But how do you tell your wife something like that? Lori always looked younger than her years and made every effort to maintain her appearance. Frankly, that was part of her appeal to me, and I was proud of her for looking so young, even if sometimes I too was embarrassed by some of her clothing choices. Besides, it wasn't about the clothes. It was about the relationship between Lori and Emily. When Emily was a baby, Lori always hovered over her, spending time with her every chance she got. But as Emily grew older, their relationship began to change. By the time Emily moved on to high school, Lori often acted like she was Emily's sister instead of her mother. I knew that teenagers needed to be removed from their parents so they could form their own identity and personality. But Lori didn't seem to notice this and continued to meddle in Emily's life. I was reminded of an incident when Emily was in junior high school, and a group of her girlfriends came over to our house. The teenagers were laughing and chatting about clothes and boys, and Lori was right in the middle of it. As I was checking papers in my office, Emily burst in and demanded, "Daddy, make Mom give me my friends back." Honestly, at times they looked more like rival high schoolers than mother and daughter. I tried to convince Lori that her daughter needed space, but Lori couldn't or wouldn't see what the problem was. "We're more like sisters," Lori replied, "and it's normal for sisters to fight sometimes." That attitude annoyed me. I felt like Lori was trying to deny the fact that she was getting older by competing with her daughter. But I didn't want to undermine Lori's authority in front of my daughter, so I tried to sidestep the issue for now, focusing on Lori's clothing choices. "Baby, your mom has worked very hard to keep herself in shape, and it's only natural for her to be proud of what she's accomplished. You have to admit that not many women can fit into the kind of clothes she wears," I said soothingly. "I know, Daddy," Emily replied, "but it embarrasses me that she wears the same clothes as my female classmates." "I understand, baby. I'll tell her something," I promised. But I knew my words were unlikely to have an effect. Lori had always been stubborn. In fact, that was partly why we'd gotten married. We'd met in college. I was a teaching assistant getting my doctorate in history, and Lori Carlton was a student in one of my classes. I liked her immediately, but I knew it was best not to give any signs of attention to a female student, especially in my class. But she couldn't help but notice my frequent glances and the attention I paid her, because she started flirting with me more and more often. After almost every lecture, she would come up to me to ask me a question, flapping her eyes and often touching my arm or hand. In the lecture hall, she sat in the front row, her skirt pulled up high enough for me to see her gorgeous legs and sometimes a hint of lace. It seemed like she was trying to break my immunity. Nevertheless, I held out until the end of the semester and then asked her out. The tension between us had built up so much that by the time she returned to my tiny apartment after dinner, we were almost suffocating. Instead of burning out, over time our relationship grew into something more solid and inclusive. By the time she was ready to graduate, I realized she was the woman I wanted to build my life around. So when she brought me to Savannah to meet her parents, I intended to ask her father for permission to marry his daughter. When we arrived at Lori's home in Savannah, we were met at the door by Cecily, Lori's younger sister, who happily hugged Lori and greeted me. Cecily was an accidental child, born about 16 years after Lori. Perhaps as a result, Lori became a second mother and role model to her younger sister. But while Cecily's greeting was warm, her mother received me coolly, and her father was downright icy. All my attempts to get him on my side were flatly rejected. Rufus Carlton was a wealthy lawyer, prominent in Savannah society, and his daughter's plans did not include marriage to some leftist, starving intellectual. I tried to assure him that A, I considered myself politically independent, and B, I had already managed to get my first teaching position at a university in Atlanta. Neither argument mattered in the slightest. Rufus had already charted a course for his daughter's life, centered on marriage to a suitable candidate from the local gentry. In his eyes, I was simply not good enough. I was angry at her father's high-handed rejection, but Lori was furious. It was then that I realized how stubborn she was. Even though we had intended to spend a long weekend with her family, after a private conversation with her father, she jumped out of the house, grabbed her things, and demanded that we return to Atlanta immediately. Along the way, I learned a lot about her tumultuous relationship with her father. Lori may have been the oldest, but she acted more like a second child, constantly rebelling against the restrictions her father tried to set. They were like oil and water, except not only did they not mix, but they couldn't coexist next to each other. "I'll be damned if I'm going to let my father run my life," she said firmly. When we finally got back to my apartment, she grabbed me by the shoulders and asked me almost angrily, "Do you still want to marry me?" When I readily confirmed that I did, she said, "Okay, let's go." With those words, she dragged me back to the car and drove me to the Fulton County Clerk of Court's office where we got our license and were married on the spot. Thank goodness there is no waiting period in Georgia. The result of Lori's defiance was that upon learning of her act, her father cut off all contact with his daughter. There was no contact for birthdays or Christmas. Not even the birth of a grandchild could melt the ice. Moreover, the freeze extended to the rest of the Carlton family. Early on, Lori received a letter from her younger sister, but it consisted mainly of a request for Lori to apologize to her father. Lori didn't. Several times over the years, I tried to repair the relationship because I felt that family was too important to write it off as some kind of hopeless debt. But my attempts were ignored. I had no doubt where Lori got that stubbornness from. Immersed in my memories, I was surprised to realize that we had made it to campus and were heading towards the bookstore. I pulled a few strings and managed to get Emily a summer job there. When she opened the car door to get out, I grabbed her arm. "Hey, what time should I pick you up this afternoon?" She hesitated for a moment, then turned and smiled at me. "You don't have to pick me up, Daddy. I'll make my own way home." I tried not to frown, but I could still feel my gut clench. I was morally certain that her boyfriend, Brandon Hilton, would drive her. It's natural for a father to have custody of his daughter, but my reservations about Brandon went beyond the usual paternal reservations. He was a third-year law student, and it bothered me that some of the upperclassmen were showing interest in a freshman. I knew that many upperclassmen pounced on new female students like wolves on newborn lambs. Likewise, I had seen the hearts of many inexperienced girls, fresh out of high school and eager to experience life on their own for the first time, break. But I believe that a law student should be looking for a woman closer to his age to start a life together, not pursuing a girl who is still in her teens. His interest made me extremely wary, but Emily was clearly crazy about him, and Lori, who had once had a long conversation with Brandon when he came after Emily, had no qualms about it. So I swallowed my protest and just said, "Okay, babe, I'll see you at dinner tonight." From there, I headed to the history department, still doubting my daughter. I had no illusions about her innocence. I was sure she'd been molested by the little creep she'd dated during her last 2 years of high school, but Lori and I had had some frank discussions with her, and Lori had quietly arranged for Emily to take birth control pills, so at least she was protected in that regard. Still, I wished Brandon Hilton would just disappear and let my daughter find someone closer in age. Sighing, I made my way to my tiny office and started on the administrative minutiae that colleges require even in summer sessions. But this chore could not contain my enthusiasm as I began to think about the course I would be teaching. I managed to convince the head of the history department to let me teach an elective on the same topic on which I had written my doctoral dissertation: vigilantism. My hypothesis was that vigilantes played a more significant role in history than is commonly believed, and that they presented a complex moral dilemma for society. For example, American lore is full of stories of vigilantes who are forced to seek justice alone. We Americans tend to sympathize with such figures and find them appealing. To illustrate this, I plan to show the class excerpts from Death Wish, a movie starring Charles Bronson about an architect who is forced to become a vigilante after his wife is murdered because the police cannot find the perpetrators. To counterbalance this, I also assigned the class to read The Oxbow Incident, a classic Western by Walter Van Tilburg Clark. which is about a posse that apprehends several cattle thieves but learns that their captors are innocent. The first class went well. The students seemed to understand the moral and social dilemma, and I know they appreciated watching violent movies. The story doesn't have to be boring. When I got home after lunch, I was in a good mood, and it lasted until the front door slammed and I heard Emily running to her room in tears. The door to her room was closed, but I could hear her crying inside. I knocked. "Can I come in, Emily?" "Okay, Daddy," I heard her mumble, turned the knob, and entered. Our daughter was lying face down on the bed, her back rising and falling with sobs. I sat down beside her and pulled her to me. She didn't resist. In fact, she clung to me like she did when she had a scraped knee as a child. Her tears wet the front of my shirt. I ached for her obvious pain, but some part of me was glad she still needed her daddy. "What happened, baby girl?" I asked, lifting her chin so I could see her face. "Brandon left me," she managed to mumble before her crying resumed. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry," I told her, but I wasn't being completely honest. If Brandon Hilton was out of her life, that was fine with me. However, I knew I couldn't tell her that, so I just hugged her and stroked her back, trying to comfort her while she cried. After a while, I heard Lori walk in and hoped that a little feminine perspective might help. Leaving Emily in her room, I hurried downstairs to consult with my wife. "We had a bit of a tragedy today," I explained to her. "Brandon dumped Emily, and now she's inconsolable." "Good," Lori replied. "About time." I was stunned. I'd expected a little more motherly sympathy. "But I thought you liked Brandon," I replied. "He wasn't right for her," Lori replied sharply. "Don't you have something to say to her?" I asked uncertainly. I asked uncertainly. "Right now, it's best to leave Emily alone. She'll get over it soon enough. Girls that age do that." I was surprised. I thought Lori would be caring and sympathetic, and it turned out that role was reserved for me. I mentally shook my head again at the mystery of the mother-daughter relationship. "I hope you're right," I said and left that question for later. My doubts were only reinforced when Emily never came down for dinner that night. She had breakfast the next morning, but immediately felt nauseous and went back to bed. I informed the bookstore manager that she was sick and hoped Lori's opinion was correct. The next day, Emily went to work, but she still hadn't eaten much. She'd given up on the idea of breakfast altogether. I started to wonder if she'd gotten some kind of stomach flu, but she said she was fine, so I let it go. It was clear to me that she was still deeply upset about the sudden breakup with Brandon, but Lori seemed to be right. She was feeling a little better. That assessment only lasted until Friday. I stayed at the office late that day, trying to get some extra stuff done so I wouldn't have to work over the weekend. As a result, I got home at almost 6 in the evening. Setting my laptop aside in the study, I went in search of Lori and Emily. The door to Emily's room was closed, and I heard crying coming from inside again. I knocked gently, and when I opened the door, I found Emily in tears on the bed. When she looked up at me, there was sadness mixed with fear on her face, and for a second I thought she was going to run away. But then her shoulders slumped, and she suddenly threw herself into my arms, crying even harder. "Baby, baby, what's wrong?" I pleaded. "What happened?" She held her face buried in my shoulder for another minute, then raised a pained look at me. "Oh, Daddy," she sobbed. "I'm pregnant." I felt a little dizzy and turned around and sank down next to her on the bed. I was so shocked and stunned I could barely think straight, and I heard myself ask two of the stupidest questions of my life. "Are you sure?" I sighed. Then realizing how stupid the question was, I added, "How did this happen?" Thankfully, Emily was so upset that she simply answered my nonsensical questions. "Yesterday, I took one of those home pregnancy tests, and it came back positive. So today, I went to the student health center. Daddy, the doctor said I'm about 6 weeks pregnant." "But you've been on the pill," I protested. "You can't be pregnant." "I know," she sobbed. "I told the doctor that. But she said the pill doesn't work 100% of the time and that I must be one of the lucky 1%. I pulled her to me, and at that moment I think we both regretted that she was still a little girl, and this was all a bad dream. We sat like that for quite a while, not talking, just holding each other. Finally, I loosened my grip so I could look at her again. "What's your mom going to say about this?" I asked. "She doesn't know yet, Daddy. Mommy hasn't come home yet." I was annoyed with Lori. Of all the days to be late, this was the one I needed her advice and perspective on, but I pushed the irritation to the back of my mind because I knew my daughter needed me. I glanced at the clock on her nightstand and saw that it was 7 o'clock. It's getting late. Let's go downstairs and try to get something to eat, I said to Emily. We walked to the kitchen together and found some leftovers in the fridge to heat up. After we ate for a while, I asked, "Have you talked to Brandon about this?" Her face darkened again. I tried to call him today, but his number was disconnected. His landlord said he was out of town and didn't leave a forwarding address. About what I expected, I thought unpleasantly, but I didn't say anything out loud because I didn't want to upset Emily any further. So I asked the question that had been weighing on me the most since I'd learned of her condition. Have you thought about what you want to do next? I deliberately phrased the question ambiguously, but Emily understood exactly what I was asking. Oh, Daddy, I don't know what I want to do. I'm not ready to be a mother, and having a baby would really mess up my college education, but I just don't think I can get it over with. More tears streamed down her cheeks. Though her next words were soft, they were decisive. Daddy, I think I want to have a baby. I walked around the table and hugged her. If that's what you decide, honey, Mom and I will support you in any way we can. We'll get through this. Emily looked up at me. I love you, Daddy, was all she said, but it was enough. I sat back down and we finished dinner. Another glance at the clock showed that it was already 8 o'clock. Where on earth was Lori? I tried calling her cell phone, but it must have been turned off because my call went straight to voicemail. Then I tried calling her office at the newspaper, but no one answered there either. Finally, I decided to call Jackie, her best friend. But when I reached her, Jackie said she hadn't talked to Lori in days and didn't know anything about Lori's plans for the evening. When I hung up, Emily looked at me with concern. Is everything okay with Mom? She asked. She probably has some kind of meeting or interview tonight. She probably told me about it and I forgot, I reassured Emily. In fact, I was pretty sure there was nothing on Lori's calendar that would make her late today, and I was starting to worry. But I didn't want to worry Emily. She had enough to worry about as it was, so she and I went into the room and turned on the TV. One of those talent search programs was on, and she and I passed the time by making snide remarks about the performances and the judges. By the time the program was over, Emily was half asleep, and I advised her to head to bed. You've had a pretty rough day, I told her, and you could probably use some sleep. I'll let your mom know what's going on when she gets home and we can talk about it tomorrow. Emily left for her room and I was left waiting for Lori. Where was that woman? I was awakened by the sun streaming through the windows of my room, and I shuddered at the realization that I had fallen asleep on the couch. I quickly got up and checked our bedroom, but Lori wasn't there. I checked the garage just in case, but her car was still gone. Now I was really worried. I called her cell phone again, but got nothing. The office didn't answer either. After much searching, I found the home number of her supervisor from the newspaper. His answer was even more disturbing. Lori came to the office on Friday but left mid-afternoon saying she had a meeting, and she still hadn't returned. I had never had to look for a missing person before, and I had absolutely no idea what to do. Increasingly worried, I started calling local hospitals to see if any patients matching her description had been admitted. To no avail. Finally, in desperation, I called the police. It took several redirects, but I finally spoke to a sergeant who told me they had no reports of accidents or unidentified victims of criminal gambling that fit Lori's description. Okay, I said, but how do I file a missing persons report? You can't, the sergeant told me, unless the person has been missing for at least 72 hours. When I started to protest, he interrupted me. Look, the most likely scenario is that something happened unexpectedly and your wife didn't have time to tell you about it. We can't mobilize the entire police force every time one spouse forgets to inform the other of their plans. The fact that her car is also missing makes this scenario very likely. But if your wife doesn't show up, I've already recorded your call, so the clock is ticking down to 72 hours. And if you can give me the make, model, and license plate number, I'll have our guys keep an eye on her car just in case. I gave the sergeant the information and thanked him for his time. I couldn't believe that Lori could go anywhere without at least calling to let me know her whereabouts, but I couldn't think of anything else I could do to help find her. The only thing left for me to do was to try to do my best to make sure Emily didn't get too upset. I spent the rest of the day calling everyone I could think of to see if anyone knew where Lori had gone. No one could offer any leads. I even considered calling Savannah, but given our history, I couldn't imagine Lori going there. All weekend I felt like Emily and I were in prison because we were afraid to leave the house for fear that Lori would come home and we would miss her. We felt cut off from the rest of the world. The phone rang a few times, but each time it was only a concerned friend hoping for good news. Loneliness, anxiety, and depression were our only companions. On Monday, Emily was still plagued by morning sickness, but she discovered that if she didn't eat or inhale the odor of breakfast being prepared, the worst effects could be avoided. Accordingly, I switched to cold cereal, although I still made coffee. I talked Emily into going to work at the bookstore, if only to take her mind off her mother for a little while. She finally agreed. I dropped her off and went home to wait. I didn't have a lecture until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Around 10 a.m., the phone rang, and to my surprise, it was the same police sergeant I had spoken to on Saturday. "Mr. Manning, have you heard from your wife yet?" he inquired. I informed him that I had not. "Very well, it's been 72 hours, so we're going to activate your missing persons report. Could you come down to the station and help us fill out the forms?" "Sure," I told him. "I'll be right down." When I arrived at the police station, the detective from the missing persons unit led me to his desk. I thought I had given the sergeant all the information he needed, but the detective wanted a lot more details. After almost an hour of questions, I thought we were done, but I was wrong. The detective looked at me carelessly and said, "By the way, I think we found your wife's car." "What?" I said, stunned. "Where is she?" "Actually, it was on the top floor of the parking lot near the campus where you teach," he said. He paused to let me digest what he'd said, then continued. "Are you sure you didn't see your wife on Friday?" "No," I answered without hesitation. "Not since we had breakfast that morning." "Very well, Mr. Manning. That will be all for today." I felt a little defensive. "May I take my wife's car keys?" The detective shook his head. "Oh no, forensics is checking them for evidence. Fingerprints, bloodstains, and the like." That shook me up pretty badly. Could something terrible have happened to Lori? The next few days were horrible. I was haunted by the thought that Lori had been kidnapped and molested, or worse. I remembered how annoyed I'd been when she didn't come home that night, and I felt ashamed of my unkind thoughts. At the same time, I tried my best to calm Emily down. Her nerves were already on edge because of the pregnancy, and losing her mother had driven her almost to hysterics. Added to the fear for her mother's safety was the paranoia for her own safety, and the safety of the unborn child. Lori's disappearance shook us both to our core. And then it got worse. A missing persons detective called me and asked me to come down to the station. When I arrived, I was ushered into a small room where another detective was waiting. The first detective introduced her as a member of the homicide squad. When I heard this, I thought I was going to faint. I collapsed into a wooden chair and managed to whisper, "Did you find Lori? Is she—" "No," said the female detective. "We didn't find her. But we were able to find out some important information. We checked the airlines and bus companies. None of them have any record of a woman matching your wife's description traveling that Friday or Saturday. We checked your bank and nothing was withdrawn from your joint checking or savings accounts. We checked the credit card company and nothing was withdrawn from her account. So we don't have any answers yet, Mr. Manning, but we do have a number of questions for you." I was stunned. Why? I've told you everything I know about Lori's disappearance." She looked at me coldly. "Your wife was last seen leaving the newspaper office in her car, which we later found in the university parking lot. We examined her entire car, Mr. Manning. The only fingerprints we found other than hers were yours. How do you explain that?" I was dumbfounded. What's there to explain? I rode in her car and even drove it a few times. Of course my fingerprints are there. How good was your relationship with your wife, Mr. Manning? Were there no fights over money or infidelity or anything like that?" she asked. Suddenly, everything fell into place. "Are you asking me if I had anything to do with my wife's disappearance? I can't believe it. After all, I'm the one who reported her missing." The detective crossed her arms. "It's not uncommon in cases like this," she said calmly. "In cases like this?" I sighed. Are you accusing me of a crime? Do I need a lawyer? She cast a quick glance at her partner. If you think you need a lawyer, Mr. Manning, you can certainly get one. But I haven't done anything, I shouted. My wife is out there somewhere in danger. You should be looking for her, not pestering me with silly questions and innuendos. Calm down, Mr. Manning, said the first detective. We're just trying to find possible motives for your wife's sudden disappearance. You're the most logical person to start with, wouldn't you agree? Don't you want to help us find her? Still frustrated, I sat back in my chair. Of course I do, I replied sharply. Okay, what do you want to know? Said nah. Were there any problems between you and your wife, Mr. Manning? No, I answered confidently. None at all? She asked. Not a single disagreement? Well, nothing major, I said. And what are some minor problems? She asked. We've had the same arguments as any couple married for 20 years, I said. You know, like disagreements about how to raise our daughter. She leaned across the table to me. Have there been any disagreements about your daughter recently, Mr. Manning? Any events or new situations involving her? I leaned back in my chair. Unmarried motherhood was no longer as embarrassing an event as it used to be, but I still felt uncomfortable talking about it. Yes, one situation, detective. My daughter is pregnant. The two exchanged glances. The man spoke quickly. And what was Mrs. Manning's reaction when she learned of your daughter's condition? Before I could answer, the woman entered the conversation. Maybe that's what made her run away? Maybe she was upset by the news. Did you argue with your wife about what happened? Did you do something to her in the heat of the argument? All right. I jumped to my feet and leaned across the table toward the woman with anger. The male detective quickly grabbed my arm and sat me back in my chair. Calm down, Mr. Manning. Calm down. He threw the woman an angry look. My partner got a little carried away. We're just trying to explore all the possibilities. I took a deep breath and tried to relax, but the detective wouldn't let go of my hand. I kept my eyes on the woman who was stepping back nervously. The only person I love more than my wife is my daughter, and I would die trying to protect either of them. For that matter, Lori didn't even know about our daughter. The night I found out about my daughter's condition, Lori didn't come home. I looked over my shoulder at the detective standing behind me. Those insinuations are enough for me all day. Unless you're going to accuse me of a crime I didn't commit, I'm out of here. It's okay, Mr. Manning, the detective said behind me, loosening his grip and pointing me toward the door. We don't have anything else for you right now. He swung the door open in front of me. However, we may need to ask you some more questions later. I started to walk out the door, but he stopped me. One last thing, Mr. Manning. Don't plan on leaving town anytime soon. I gave him a glare and walked out. The door closed behind me, and I heard angry voices. As I drove home, I was so angry I was shaking. But as my adrenaline levels started to drop, I began to rationalize what had happened. Of course, they have to check all the possibilities, I said to myself. But that didn't make me feel any better. All I was doing was trying to find my missing wife. I couldn't even think about the accusation that I might have hurt Lori without my blood pressure rising. Why would she even think that? I growled angrily. Of course, when I got home, Emily wanted to know what I'd learned from the police. I didn't want to upset her further, so I just told her that they didn't have any new information, but they just wanted to double-check some details. Afterward, I bitterly thought, now I'm starting to lie to my own daughter. What the hell? The next day brought a new humiliation. The police came to our house with a search warrant. I had to sit on the veranda for 2 hours while they searched the house, looking in every nook, cranny, and cranny. I don't know exactly what they were looking for, but whatever it was, they didn't find it. I used the time to call my lawyer. It looked like I was definitely going to need one. But just as the police were about to leave, a tow truck pulled up to our driveway and took my car. They promised I could have it back in a couple of days, but since they still had Lori's car, I had to have a neighbor drive me to the rental place so I could have transportation. The only blessing was that Emily wasn't around during this ordeal, but neither she nor I could avoid what happened next. 2 days later, I opened the local news section of our newspaper and found the following headline. Lori's husband is person of interest in local woman's disappearance. The article again talked about Lori's disappearance and added information about a search warrant and a check of my car. The article never said it in so many words, but It clearly implied that foul play was likely and that my husband, me, was the most likely suspect. Emily cried after reading the article, and I called my lawyer in a rage. Is there nothing I can do to stop this? They've practically tried and convicted me already, and they don't even know if a crime was committed. I want to sue for defamation. My lawyer did his best to reassure me. John, I've already looked into the matter. I believe the police may have planted this story to try to put pressure on you. But you'll never be able to prove it because reporters aren't obligated to reveal their sources. As for defamation, there are no factual inaccuracies in this story. It is only the manner in which they are presented that is defamatory. Remember, Lori has a lot of friends at the paper. You'll have to be patient until this resolves itself. Bitch, I swore helplessly to myself. When I entered my office at the university in the afternoon, I found a note on the door asking the chairman of the history department to admit me. As soon as I reached Henry Vance's office, his secretary immediately ushered me inside. He got straight to the point. John, in light of the whole Lori thing, we think it would be best if someone else took over your summer session until this matter is settled. Henry, I said, it's Lori who's missing, not me. Of course, it's very hard for me right now, but there's no reason why I can't continue the course. Of course, he said, of course. But with that cloud over you, if you continue teaching, it will look bad for the department and bad for the university. You understand, don't you? I jumped to my feet. Oh, I understand all right. I understand that you want me gone, even though no charges have been brought against me, and there is no evidence that a crime was ever committed. Henry, you're a professor of American history, for God's sake. Don't you realize that a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty? He clearly hadn't expected me to object and was dumbfounded. I felt I had the upper hand and continued. Isn't it ironic that I'm teaching a course on the role of vigilantes in history, and you're ready to stage an old-fashioned lynching? Good God, John, that's not the point, he hissed. It's not about that? Then tell me, I continued. Is the rector prepared to support you if I refuse to go? And have you checked with the faculty senate to see what they think? Because unless you have checked, and unless you have been given direct authority to suspend me, I will return to this lecture hall this afternoon and give my course. And if you try to stop me, I promise I'll make such a fuss that you'll be the one asked to resign. He sat down abruptly in his chair and I leaned my back against his desk. I love this university and I will never do anything to damage its reputation. That includes me not succumbing to some misguided notion of frontier justice from someone who isn't authorized to act and doesn't know the facts. With those words, I turned and walked out of his office. I wondered if anyone from security was waiting for me as I walked to the lecture hall for class, but the only people who showed up there were my students. Interestingly, attendance was perfect. I guess it helps to have a famous lecturer, I thought wryly. I had planned to give a lecture on the comparison between vigilantes and terrorists, but I decided to skip that discussion and tell them about myself. I assumed that everyone in the class knew about my situation and thought that what was happening to me might be instructive. So I began the discussion by recounting the events of the past 2 days, including the news about me and my meeting with the head of the history department. I began by reading a newspaper article about Lori's disappearance. And here's a question for you. Can the media ever become vigilantes? Is there a line between factual reporting and provocation? When challenged, I asked them to recall what role William Randolph Hearst and his network of newspapers played in sparking the Spanish-American War. Hearst didn't fire a single shot, but most historians cite him as the spark that ignited the conflict, I told them. What about Chairman Vance from the history department? I asked. Did he act in good faith? As a responsible defender of the university's reputation, or as a vigilante who decided to act of his own accord, without evidence or authority? We had a great discussion, and most of the students didn't want to leave when the class was over. I didn't like what was happening to me, but at least I was able to use it to make the course content more understandable to my students. It was a teachable moment, as they say. Although I didn't hear anything more from the university administration, the newspaper article did have an effect. When the first news of Lori's disappearance appeared in the paper, Emily and I received a flood of calls from friends and neighbors with condolences, suggestions, and just words of encouragement. After a while, there were so many that I wanted to leave the calls on my answering machine. I felt helpless and frustrated because I couldn't say anything to the callers. Of course, I couldn't do that because I was still hoping to hear from Lori. But after the second article came out, The number of calls dropped to almost zero. It was as if we were quarantined by some infectious disease. Now our friends wanted nothing to do with us. I seemed to be a victim of what had befallen Lori. Because we were so isolated, I was caught off guard when the phone rang on an evening a few days later. It was calling someone I was in no way expecting to hear from. My father-in-law, Rufus Carlton. "You bastard," he shouted as soon as I spoke into the receiver. "What have you done to my daughter?" I took a deep breath and decided to try to be polite. "Good evening to you too, Rufus. To answer your question, I will say that none of us know what happened to Lori, and we're doing everything we can to find her." "Don't talk nonsense to me," he muttered back. "When a wife goes missing, it's always the husband's fault. I knew you were nothing but trouble from the moment I met you, but Lori wouldn't listen to me and turned her back on her family because of you. But she's still my daughter, damn it, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. I've got people working on this, and we're going to string you up and snap your neck before this is over. Do you hear me?" I couldn't contain my anger any longer. "I can hear you just fine, Rufus. And you know what? You didn't know me when I was courting Lori, and you certainly don't know me now. As for Lori, all I can say is that you have a funny way of showing your love for your daughter by cutting her off without a word for 20 years. If we don't hear from you for another 20 years, it'll be too soon for me." With those words, I slammed the receiver down, hoping his eardrum would burst in the process. Then, I sank into my chair, shaking with anger. I was tired of being tried and convicted in absentia for something I hadn't done. Meanwhile, my wife was missing, and I missed her terribly. Worse, I knew that with each passing day, our chances of finding her again were diminishing. It was enough to drive a man crazy. Fortunately, one thing that helped me keep my sanity came from an unlikely source: my daughter. A few days after Rufus's call, she came to me with a request. "Daddy, I want to take a Lamaze class to learn more about the birthing process, but I really need a partner and I don't have anyone who can do it. Will you come with me, Daddy?" Of course, I said yes, and a few nights later we found ourselves in a conference room at the local hospital. There were about a dozen couples with us, and the women were in various stages of pregnancy. Some of them looked so far along that I was nervous. Suddenly, something was going to happen this night. An attractive red-headed woman, who was a few years younger than me, came over to greet us. "Hi, welcome to Lamaze class. I'm Bridget Murphy, and I'll be teaching the class." As I regarded her, Emily introduced herself to Bridget. The latter spoke to her briefly, and then suggested that Emily meet the other moms-to-be before the class started. She then turned to me with a smile and said, "And you are?" I paid no attention and mumbled, "Oh, I'm John Manning. I'm the father." Bridget's smile immediately turned into an unfriendly frown, and I blushed, realizing what she was thinking. No, I said hastily. "I mean that I'm Emily's father, not the baby's." Her face relaxed. "In that case, welcome to class. I apologize for jumping to conclusions, but I've seen worse things in the maternity ward. So where is the baby's father?" I frowned. "Unfortunately, he's gone to an unknown destination, so I'll be Emily's partner in all of this." Bridget smiled warmly at me. "I'm sorry to hear about your father. Unfortunately, that happens a lot these days. But I think it's wonderful that you want to be there for your daughter. Not every father would agree to help." I looked over and saw Emily chatting animatedly with the other moms-to-be, so I decided to speak frankly to Bridget about our situation. I felt awkward about what I had to say, but I wanted to lay all my cards on the table so there wouldn't be any awkward moments later. "Before we start, Bridget, there's something you should know about me. I don't know if you've read about it in the papers, but I'm the John Manning whose wife disappeared. I had nothing to do with it, but if you saw the report on the news, you might think otherwise. In any case, if you're uncomfortable with my presence, I'll try to make other arrangements." She looked at me calculatingly, then smiled weakly. "You're here for your daughter. That's all that matters to me. Besides, in my experience, cold-blooded killers rarely attend Lamaze classes. Now we need to start the session." I had taken Lamaze classes with Lori before Emily was born, but I had to admit that I had forgotten almost everything I had learned. Nevertheless, I tried to be supportive of Emily, and she really enjoyed the first class. She seemed to hit it off with Bridget right from the start, which helped a lot. Getting out of the house and, more importantly, out of my own head to focus on Emily has been a real blessing for me. The stress of worrying about Lori on the one hand, and anger at those who held me responsible for her disappearance on the other, was worse than anything I'd experienced in my life. Being able to forget about it all, even if only for an hour or so a week, proved to be a lifesaver. Although the calls from friends and neighbors stopped as soon as suspicion fell on me, it wasn't the end of all outside contact. I was stunned when I first picked up the phone, and a man I didn't know began spewing invective at me for killing my wife. After that, I occasionally found hate mail from anonymous writers condemning me to perdition for what they said I had done to Lori. There were even those who reported that they knew how I did it and where the body was buried. If that wasn't enough, I even received an offer of money from one of the supermarket tabloids if I confessed to their reporter. As a result, I almost threw away a handwritten letter with no return address that I found in my mailbox one afternoon. But I did open it, and when I started reading it, I almost fell over. John, I just saw a story about you in the local paper. I'm so sorry. I never thought anyone would think anything had happened to me, much less that you might have done something terrible. Please tell the police that I am alive and well and living with the man I love. File for divorce if you haven't already. I'm not coming back. Don't try to find me. It was what I had to do. Please tell Emily that I still love her despite what I did to her. Lori. At that moment, Emily came into the room, and when she saw my face, she cried, "Daddy, what happened?" I held out a letter to her. "It's from your mom." She cried out weakly and took the letter from me with trembling hands. When she read it, she burst into tears of pity and collapsed in my arms. "How could she do that, Daddy? How could she leave us like that? She didn't even say goodbye." As I held Emily in my arms, I was reminded of an incident when she was very young and wandered into the backyard. We almost went crazy not finding her and were ready to go to the authorities when a neighbor brought her to us. I vividly remember the conflicting emotions, relief that she was safe and anger at her for scaring us half to death. Now I was feeling the same mix of emotions, relief that our long nightmare was over, and rage at Lori's selfish betrayal of her family. Emily was the first to come to her senses. "Daddy, we have to take this letter to the police immediately." Of course, I realized she was right and went to get my wallet and keys. When I got back to the den, she was just coming out of her room. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. And I didn't argue with her. We were together. As we drove to the train station, Emily nervously rubbed the letter she had received in her hands. She looked at me with concern on her face. "Are you going to divorce Mom, Dad?" I sensed that Emily was in a precarious state, and I didn't want to upset her further, so I simply said, "Well, I need to talk to a lawyer and see what he says." But she interrupted me. "I really think you should, Daddy. I really think you should." I hated to see the rift between Emily and her mother, but Lori had brought it on herself. She had left Emily just as she had left me for another man. Emily was old enough to realize this and accept reality, no matter how painful it was. She reached for me, and we held each other's hand the rest of the way to the police station. I hadn't even thought to call ahead, but luckily we got a detective on duty that we had dealt with in the missing persons department. As he led us to his desk, I asked him, "Where's your partner from homicide?" With some reluctance, he went to get her. Ever since we'd run into each other at the station, she had been absent whenever the cops talked to me. When she arrived, I took the letter from Emily and tossed it on the table in front of them. "This came in the mail today," I said curtly. The male detective opened the envelope and quickly read the letter. He glanced at me and silently handed it to the woman. When she finished, she looked at me. "You could have written it yourself, you know." I felt anger rising in me, but restrained myself. Of course I could have. And I could have flown to New York to mail it to myself, or didn't you notice the postmark? She started to answer, but to my surprise, Emily interrupted her. "And before you accuse my father of forgery, I brought along an old letter my mother wrote me when I left for camp. You can see it's her handwriting." The first detective took Emily's old letter and put it next to the new one. His partner looked over his shoulder. They looked at each other, and then the first detective looked at me again. "We'll have to take this to the lab for confirmation, but I think the missing person case is solved." He held out his hand. "I apologize for all this suspicion," he said, "but we had to check." I reluctantly shook it, but when the female detective held out her hand, I turned away and Emily and I walked out. I guess I'd been naive. I expected there to be some official notification that the case was closed, but there was nothing like that. Yes, I was no longer a suspect since there was no crime, but my reputation was tarnished and I had no absolution for my non-existent sin. I had to have my lawyer call the newspaper and resort to veiled threats before they agreed to publish the news. And when they agreed, all I got was a couple paragraphs at the bottom of the last page of the local news with the headline, "The Case of the Missing Wife, the Case of the Runaway Spouse." I was practically front-page news when everyone thought I was over her, I protested to my attorney. Now that I've been acquitted, all I've gotten is a few lines. Is that fair? He shook his head. Unfortunately, that's the way it goes, John. Mysterious disappearances and possible murders are news, and the plain truth doesn't sell in the papers. I'm sorry, but that's all you can get. I gritted my teeth, but realized there was nothing I could do to change the situation. In desperation, I made a photocopy of the story and sent copies to everyone I cared about. I put a copy on Henry Nance's desk, and he at least had the courtesy to make an embarrassed face and mutter congratulations. I even laminated a copy of the article and stuck it in my wallet so I could pull it out and show it to people when it came up. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people chose fiction over a true story. One thing I didn't do was send a copy to Rufus Carlton. Let his highly paid detectives find out what his daughter has done, I thought to myself. All of this had one positive result. After the police confirmed the authenticity of the letter, I easily filed for a divorce on grounds of desertion and quickly obtained an absentee judgment. This resolved any potential legal problems and allowed me to be single again. Soon, I hoped, I could begin to move on with my life. Throughout this process, I continued to attend Lamaze classes with Emily at Bridget Murphy's clinic. Emily became close to Bridget, and several times the three of us would go out for coffee after class. Bridget's story was a sad one. She married her college sweetheart right after graduation and before he was deployed to Afghanistan for his ROTC duties. She became pregnant while he was on leave, but he was killed in an IED explosion before she learned the happy news. Shortly afterward, Bridget had a miscarriage and lost the baby. She also lost the opportunity to have more children. Such terrible circumstances would have stunned many people, but instead of succumbing to despair, Bridget somehow found the strength to dedicate herself to helping others. She enrolled in nursing school and specialized in midwifery so she could help other women give birth. One manifestation of her dedication was the Lamaze classes she taught. I marveled at her resilience and marveled at her ability to work with young moms. I once told her, "As a professional educator, I have to say I am amazed at your ability to teach these women skills that don't come naturally. You have a real gift." She blushed and said it was only because her class was so motivated, but I knew it takes more than motivation to get a good education. Then Emily and I were driving home from class one evening when she surprised me with a question. "Did you notice what Bridget is wearing today?" she asked. I couldn't tell Emily what outfit Bridget was wearing, but I did notice that she had changed out of her nurse's uniform and into her regular clothes. "She was also wearing makeup, Daddy." "Oh," I said dejectedly. "Well, that's nice." "Don't you see, Daddy, she's dressing up for you," Emily said disappointedly. "Why would she do that?" I asked, not understanding. Emily shook her head, marveling at my stupidity. "Because, Daddy, she likes you. I think you should ask her out. It's high time you got back in the game." After my divorce became final, I started thinking about dating again. But I wasn't doing anything about it. After all of our friends were married, and I didn't know any single women. Sure, there were plenty of them on campus, but they were mostly all Emily's age. There were a lot of reasons I didn't want anything like that. But Emily kept me on my toes, and at the end of the next class, I nervously approached Bridget and asked if she wanted to go out sometime. "You mean for coffee?" she asked with a twinkle in her eye. "No, I mean maybe dinner and a movie," I replied awkwardly. "With Emily?" she asked, and I could swear I saw a hint of a smirk at the corners of her mouth. "No," I replied stammeringly. "Maybe just you and me. That is, if you don't want Emily to come. That would be fine too." Now she was definitely enjoying my discomfort. "No, just you and me, John." And so I started dating again. I was very apprehensive about rekindling the relationship. Not only had I been out of the game for 20 years, but courting Lori was filled with drama and wild swings of emotion. I was sure I couldn't go through it again. Bridget allayed all my fears. She was extremely calm and centered emotionally, very much disliked games, and was confident enough to not need constant stroking of her ego. In short, she was the anti-Lori, and that helped me get over the pain and resentment I felt about Lori leaving me. With Bridget, I was able to relax and be myself. I wasn't going to rush things, but truth be told, I was starting to figure out how I was going to build a life together with her. Emily's baby was due around the 1st of March, and her pregnancy was going very well. Even the morning sickness disappeared after the first month, so I didn't regret taking a day trip to our college town in Columbus the day before Valentine's Day. It was only a 2-hour drive, and before I hit the road, I reminded Emily to call me on my cell phone if anything happened. The ride was pleasant, and I was able to go about my business in peace. We had a late lunch, and before hitting the road back, I decided to check my phone for messages. To my dismay, the battery was dead and I hadn't noticed. I quickly grabbed my phone on campus to call my daughter, but there was no answer. This alarmed me, so I called Bridget to ask her to check on Emily and make sure everything was okay. When I got through, Bridget's voice was quite different from her usual calm tone. "Thank God you called," she said. "Emily's water broke right after you left. She's in the hospital now with severe contractions. Don't take any chances, but you need to get back here as soon as possible." Panicked, I jumped in my car and sped toward Atlanta. Usually, the I-85 freeway is jammed with highway patrol cars because of Fort Benning, but I somehow managed to avoid the radar traps and made it to the hospital in just 90 minutes. When the elevator let me out into the maternity ward, the nurses quickly dressed me, but instead of leading me to the delivery room, they took me to a semi-detached room. As I entered the room, all I saw was my daughter lying in the bed holding my own daughter, my granddaughter. My heart simultaneously squeezed at the fact that I had missed the birth, and I was relieved that mom and baby were okay. When my field of vision widened a little, I realized Bridget was standing by Emily's bedside with a wide smile on her face, cooing over the new life Emily was holding in her arms. Seeing me, Bridget smiled widely and began to step aside. "Now I'll let you be alone with Emily and her baby," she said, but Emily grabbed her arm. "Please don't go," Emily pleaded. She looked up at me. "Daddy, when I couldn't reach you, I called Bridget. She came to get me, brought me to the hospital, and coached me the whole way." All I could do was look at Bridget with sincere gratitude. I didn't have the words to express my appreciation. Emily looked at me, at Bridget, and smiled happily. "I've decided what I'm going to name my baby, Bridget Valentine Manning." She turned to Bridget. "If that's okay with you, of course." Bridget smiled through her tears. "If that's what you want, I'd be honored." Emily turned to me again. "Daddy, would you like to hold your granddaughter?" It had been a long time since I'd held a newborn in my arms, and this baby seemed so much smaller than Emily had when she came into the world. But when I looked at baby Bridget's tiny red face, I was overcome with strong emotions, and I vowed to protect and support her as best I could. The circumstances under which she was born suddenly became far less important than the fact that she was here and now and needed her family. Nature intended for people to have children while they were young for a reason. Over the next few weeks, I thought about it, feeling the fatigue building up. Even though Emily was head over heels in her work, she still needed help. Newborns require around-the-clock attention, and more than once I'd come to class barely sleeping the night before. Emily was holding up well and not complaining, but I could see that she was just as exhausted. Besides playing with baby Bridget and changing her diapers, Emily had to breastfeed her. Bridget reminded me of how much energy this takes from a mother. It was hectic, but we managed, and as the baby grew, we began to get into a routine, albeit a much changed one. Once again, Bridget proved to be a lifesaver. She quickly enrolled Emily in parenting classes where she socialized with other parents of newborns. By the second month, Emily was already taking her new daughter to the classes and was happy to get out of the house. One day, as Emily was leaving for one of these classes, I heard the doorbell ring. This was not unusual. Emily had a hard time opening the door with a baby in her arms, so when I opened the door, I smiled, but was stunned when I saw who was standing on the doorstep. It was Lori. Ever since I received Lori's letter and learned of her act, I had thought many times about what I would say to her if I ever saw her again. I longed for the opportunity to vent my rage, call her names, and demand answers to all the questions she left behind. But when I did, I was stunned. I hadn't expected to see her again, and now that she was here, I had no words. All I could do was stand there and stare at her. "Hello, John," she said warily. "Can I come in?" As if on autopilot, I backed away from the door and she came in and sat on the couch as if nothing had changed between us. I couldn't help but study her. She was still an attractive woman, but she also seemed older, with wrinkles under her eyes and a few lines on her face that I didn't remember. Her hair looked like she didn't pay much attention to it, which wasn't like her. At least her clothes were age-appropriate, I thought, remembering how she'd annoyed Emily with her overly youthful closet. "You really got the nerve to show up here," I said finally. "Believe me," she said in a bored voice. "I was dreading it. I know you must hate me. I know how much I have hurt you." Anger was building up in me, but I tried to restrain it. "I don't think so, Lori. I don't think you even realize what you've done to Emily and to me. Forget the pain of being abandoned by Emily's wife and mother. Forget the humiliation of being left for another man. Forget the fact that you left without saying a word, without explaining yourself or even saying goodbye. Your disappearance made me the subject of a police investigation. They searched our house and impounded my car looking for bloodstains. Thanks to you, my reputation was tarnished, my friends abandoned me, and I almost lost my job at the university. I received hate calls and hate mail because complete strangers thought I killed you and hid your body. There are people ready to lynch me if this case dragged on much longer." I shouted, taking a breath and lowering the volume. "So no, I don't think you have any idea how much you hurt me." As I spoke, her face went pale, and she hung her head, unable to resist my anger. When I finished, she looked up and I saw tears streaming down her cheeks. She pulled a tissue out of her purse, wiped her eyes, and said in a low voice, "I'm so sorry, John. I had no idea about all of this. I'm so sorry." "I'm afraid sorry isn't the right word," I said sharply. At that moment, I should have sent her away, but after so many months of reflection, I couldn't help but ask, "Why did you do it? What made you leave Emily and me?" "I didn't mean to do it," she whimpered. "We started with some light flirting, and then I realized I was falling for him and had a full-blown affair. I felt so young. I didn't mean for it to happen, it just did." "Oh, yeah," I said dismissively. "That's good old Lori, frisky and carefree, stubborn and incredibly selfish. So selfish that she was willing to abandon her husband of 20 years, not to mention giving up her own daughter to pursue her little romance." "No, you're wrong," she sobbed. "I hated hurting you, and it killed me to want to leave Emily. But I just couldn't look her in the eye, not after what I'd done." I'd suspected who her lover was before, but now I was sure. "So you seduced Brandon Hilton. You stole your daughter's boyfriend and ran off with him. What a great mother you make." "That's not true," she protested. "I was trying to protect Emily. I made Brandon break up with her." I knew it was a lie as soon as I heard it. "No, you weren't trying to help Emily. You made Brandon break up with Emily to prove you were more desirable than her. No wonder you can't look your daughter in the eye. It's just pathetic." She didn't try to refute my accusations, just covered her face with her hands and sobbed. But I wasn't done with my questions yet. "So after you won the contest with your daughter, you just decided to disappear. Disappear without a word of explanation, without even packing a suitcase?" "It wasn't like that," she defended herself. "I left work early that day and went to his apartment to, you know. Anyway, when we were done and lying there, he told me he was going out of town after lunch. I begged him not to, but he was adamant. He got up to dress, and when I saw the suitcase he had packed, I thought, he's leaving me just like Emily." Then he turned and said, "So are you coming or not?" I realized that he wasn't leaving me, but still wanted me to be with him. I was ecstatic and crazy about him, and anyway, I just got in the car with him and we drove off, she said, shrugging her shoulders as if that explained everything. I knew Lori was impulsive, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. "You left taking only your clothes with you?" I asked in amazement. Her face reddened with embarrassment. "Well, I had some clothes at Brandon's apartment that I took with me in my gym bag, so I could change if I needed to after a workout." That little detail only made me angrier, but I ignored it because I still didn't understand. "What were you doing for money? You never wrote checks or used credit cards." "I felt really bad about leaving you and Emily," she said quickly. "I couldn't take the money you needed to provide for her. By this time, I had already realized how self-serving she was, so I immediately let that explanation pass my ears. No, that wasn't the reason. You just didn't want any of us to know where you went or who you went with. You decided to go on your own little romantic adventure, and you didn't want me or Emily or anyone else to know what you did. The look on her face told me that I had understood the situation correctly. But I still don't understand how you did it with no money, I continued. Brandon has a trust fund, she said. He has a lot of money. Then her face turned red again. And I had a bank account, which you didn't know about, in my maiden name. I started pacing around the room, trying to contain my anger. There was still a lot I didn't know, but I didn't care about the answers anymore. Each new revelation from her was like a body blow, even after all this time. Yes, I'd seen impulsiveness and stubbornness in her, but who would have thought they would lead to this? As I passed by the window, I happened to look outside and saw an unfamiliar car parked outside the house. That's probably where he's waiting for you, I muttered. She looked up with a strange expression on her face. No, that's Jackie. She drove me here. Where's your lover? He left me, she said through her tears. He told me one day that he had a new opportunity and I wasn't part of it. Then he left, and I was alone in New York. I tried to make it on my own, but it was too hard for me. So he dumped you the same way you dumped me, I said vindictively. I guess it's true what they say. Karma's a bitch. I guess so, she said quietly. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and gestured for Jackie to come over. Turning to me, she spoke more forcefully. I know I was stubborn and impetuous and all that other stuff you called me. Yes, I left you, and now I regret it with all my heart. And most of all, I regret leaving Emily. But you have to understand, I had no choice. Of course, I said wryly. What mother would want to tell her daughter that she stole her boyfriend from her? That was only part of the case, she said quietly. Never. Before I could answer, Jackie walked through the front door. She had a baby in her arms, and I was confused for a moment. But when Lori came over and took the baby from her, all I could exclaim was, "Oh my God." Lori looked at me sadly. Now you see why I couldn't look at both of you. She must have known what I was about to ask because she continued. When I left, I forgot my birth control pills and had trouble getting a new prescription. Brandon wouldn't use condoms, so I figured it couldn't hurt, but... Her voice broke. So did he dump you before or after you gave birth? I asked reluctantly. No. Before she could answer, the sounds of Emily returning from her parenting class reached me. Walking into the kitchen from the garage, she called out, "Hey, Daddy, whose car is that out front?" She then walked into the living room carrying baby Bridget in her arms and stopped when she saw her mom. I know I could have done better, should have thought of something to say to gently bring her up to speed. But I was so angry at what Lori had done and so stunned by the horror of the situation that I turned to my daughter and exclaimed, "Look who your mother has brought with her, your new stepsister." Then, seeing Lori looking at Emily's baby, I said, "Lori, meet baby Bridget, your new granddaughter." It took them a moment to realize what I had just said, but then they both started crying. Of course, the baby started crying too, and even Jackie started sobbing. I felt like crying too, but most of all, I felt exhausted. I didn't have the energy to play judge between Emily and her mother. No matter what Emily said, I felt like her mother would get what she deserved. Finally, I just left the room, walked to the hallway, and collapsed on the couch. From the other room, angry words came to me, accompanied by several anguished cries. I guessed that they had just realized that both children had the same father. The mother and children cried for a long time more. But after a while, I realized that the living room had become quiet, and I began to guess what was going on. I hesitated, but when I finally poked my head through the door, I saw Jackie holding baby Lori, Lori holding baby Bridget, and Emily peering over her shoulder. Noticing me, Emily gestured for me to come back into the room and walked over to me. I had no idea what to say to my daughter. Lori's revelation stunned me. I couldn't imagine the effect they had on Emily. Her own mother had stolen her boyfriend and then had a child with him. How could I alleviate Emily's suffering? But before I could say anything, Emily stunned me. "Daddy, can Mommy stay with the baby at our house for a while?" "You've got to be kidding," I gasped in shock. "After everything she's done to you and me." "I know, Dad, and I don't know if I can ever forgive her for that. But she's broke, Daddy, and she has nowhere to go. Her baby needs somewhere to live, at least until mommy gets back on her feet. Please, Daddy. After all, her baby is Bridget's half-sister and mine. I shuddered at the realization of that. Why can't she live with Jackie? I protested. Emily looked at me with annoyance. Jackie lives in a one-bedroom apartment, Dad. Well, then Lori can live with her parents. She's their responsibility. I tried. Yeah, sure, Daddy. As if, Emily replied wryly. We tried to shield Emily from the acrimony of our relationship with the Carltons, but of course she caught on to the discord early on. We both knew that was not an option. I learned 2 lessons that day. The first was that I would never understand the mother-daughter relationship. I half expected that when Emily found out about her mother's betrayal, a fight would break out. That Emily offered Lori a safe haven, even if only temporary, was beyond my imagination. The second lesson I'd learned was that it's nearly impossible for a father to refuse his daughter when she really wants something. I had pre-scheduled a meeting with Bridget for the following evening. It was the one time I didn't want to see her. My concerns must have been obvious because when Bridget opened the door and saw me, she immediately asked, "What's wrong, John? What happened?" I knew that procrastination would get me nowhere, so I led her over to the couch and sat down next to her. Bridget, there's something I have to tell you. Lori's back. A look of surprise flashed across her face, which was almost immediately replaced by pain. She sighed, then nodded slightly in understanding. And you and her decided to get back together. No, no, I almost shouted. That's not what this is about at all. I continued to explain what had happened and how Emily had insisted that I temporarily help her mother and child. Bridget's face relaxed a little, but there was still pain in her eyes as she looked at me. Don't scare me like that again, John. I've already lost one man I love. I don't think I can bear to lose another. Did she just say she loved me? I felt closer and closer to Bridget the more often we saw each other, but I wasn't sure how she felt about me. Now, hearing those words, my fears and hesitations seemed to melt away. I put my arms around her and looked into her eyes. I too have lost a spouse, but I have found another, a better one that I can love. I promise, if you need me, you won't lose me. She didn't say anything, but I thought I felt something stirring in her too. And so it was that we got to the point. I felt like my long nightmare was over too. Our lives were now heading in a new, unfamiliar direction. Bridget and I began to spend every opportunity we could together, but we decided to continue living apart, at least for now. First, we didn't want to rush things. And second, our house was still bustling with work. 2 moms taking care of 2 toddlers, plus a nanny Bridget had found who now came in every weekday to help. She was a godsend, because she allowed Emily to continue attending classes and Lori to start looking for a job to support herself and the baby. I still tried to help, but truth be told, I was in the minority. This had an unfortunate side effect. When I had more free time, I began to reflect on everything that had happened to me. It may seem contradictory, but the happier I felt with Bridget, the unhappier I became with Lori. Emily had found a way to coexist with her mother through the shared experience of caring for their infants. But I had nothing to assuage the bitterness of my ex-wife's betrayal and resentment that she had hurt me by not only deceiving me, but disappearing in a way that made me suspicious. Over time, however, I found that the focus of my resentment shifted to one person who had so far avoided consequences, Brandon Hilton. It was he who had seduced my wife. It was he who had defiled my daughter. And it was he who had sullied my name, perhaps irreparably. Even more unpleasant was the fact that seduction was no longer recognized as a crime. Apparently, society was perfectly willing to allow predators like Hilton to seduce wives and daughters and then look the other way when they walked away abruptly. Shouldn't there be some sort of punishment for all the pain and suffering they left behind? I went back and reread the Oxbow incident. This time, I felt more sympathy for the members of the squad that had hunted down the Shurshikas. Yes, they hung the wrong people, but they were forced to act by an ineffective justice system that failed to protect them. Besides, I reminded myself, the crimes these men were trying to commit were not minor. Deprive a rancher of his herd, and he may not be able to feed his family when the winter snows howl over the prairie. Steal a man's horse and you're almost certainly dooming him to a slow, lingering death of starvation and dehydration, far from human civilization. No wonder the vigilantes took up arms against the sea of troubles to pursue those they felt had wronged them. I understood that Brandon Hilton did not put my family at risk of starvation or leave me to wander on foot in the desert in search of a watering hole. But he has caused real, tangible harm to me and my family. He tarnished my reputation, turned me into a hapless cuckold, and left behind two abandoned women. As time went on, I began to spend more and more of my free time searching for his whereabouts, not to mention sleepless nights contemplating suitable forms of revenge for what he had done. Most college professors are not well paid, especially liberal arts professors. The loss of Lori's salary had cut our family budget significantly, and now I had to feed a few more mouths, as well as hire a nanny to take care of the babies. There was no way I could afford to hire a detective agency to track down my enemy, so I resorted to the poor man's alternative, the internet. Brandon had a Facebook account naturally, but it hadn't been updated in over a year. Besides, I figured he was unlikely to friend me, so I could keep track of his activities. A Google search revealed his name on a list of law students, but there was little additional information. Having discovered this, however, I went to the admissions office to see what I could find in their records. The friendly administrative assistant let me look through his file. Officially, she wasn't supposed to, but the only thing I learned was that he was also from Savannah. This discovery made me shudder. Could Lori really have known him back in the day? But I was quickly convinced of the absurdity of that idea. She must have left for college when he was only a few years old. Realizing this fact made me curse Lori again for her foolish refusal to match his age. As my search continued, I found myself becoming something of an expert on the unusual behavior of a certain daughter of a hotel chain magnate with the same last name, but I had no luck finding Brandon Hilton. He seemed to have already escaped from the group that had caught up with him. The futility of my search only strengthened my resolve to find him. Some part of me watched my actions in amazement. What did I think I would do if I found this man? Fight him? I was neither a black belt in martial arts nor an expert in unarmed combat. Plus, he was 20 years younger than me and would probably kick my ass. How did I expect to get satisfaction from him if I could even find him? But those musings did nothing to assuage my anger. He had attacked my family, stolen my wife, and destroyed our home. He dishonored me and tarnished my reputation, insults that were unbearable to me. In earlier times, I knew the answer would have been simple. In the 19th century, when honor was at stake, the offended party would challenge the other to a duel with swords or pistols. But I knew from my research that the military was largely responsible for stopping duels. Soldiers and sailors were dueling so much that the military declared it a crime. They needed soldiers on the battlefield. By the 20th century, duels had become a dead tradition. I knew the history and the reasons why society was so strongly opposed to all these extra-legal entertainments. But the same thought never left me. How could a man restore his honor without taking the law into his own hands, without becoming an avenger? So I continued my obsessive solitary search for the man I hated, though I never met him face to face, though I had no plan to deal with him even if I could find him. But none of that stopped me from sneaking to my computer every few days to see if any new information had come up. By the time spring came around, I had pretty much given up hope of ever finding out Brandon Hilton's whereabouts. I was ready to accept that he was gone and that I would never see him or hear from him again. Then one evening I was stunned when one of my search terms yielded a post from the Savannah Morning News. When I read the article, I was stunned. I immediately called Bridget to see if I could come and talk about my discovery. I couldn't discuss it with Emily because I didn't want to upset her, and I didn't want to share the news with Lori, but I couldn't keep it to myself. "I found him," I said excitedly, handing the news printout to Bridget. "You won't believe what he just did." She quickly scanned the article and handed it back to me. "I don't understand, John. I know you hate Brandon, but what does his getting married have to do with you?" I couldn't understand why Bridget wasn't shocked by this news, but then I realized that there was no way she could have realized its significance. "Bridget, Lori's maiden name was Carlton," I exclaimed. "That bastard is engaged to Cecily Carlton, Lori's sister and Aunt Emily's sister." "Unbelievable," she sighed. "Why won't he leave the Carlton family alone? It's as if he were taking revenge on the Carlton women." I hadn't thought of it that way and tried to reason. "No," I said slowly, "I don't think that's the case. But as far as he knew, it was Lori and Emily Manning. I doubt he knows Lori's maiden name. He's probably not aware that she and Cecily are related." "Maybe not," she admitted, But I still don't see how the Carltons could let Cecily become engaged to him after what he did to Emily and Lori. That's the thing, I said. They don't know either. Since Lori and I got married, there's been virtually no contact between her and her family. I'm sure they know Lori's alive now, but they probably have no idea who she ran off with. Rufus Carlton probably thinks he's gotten a promising young lawyer from Savannah to be his son-in-law. If Brandon doesn't know, and the Carltons don't know, Bridget asked, then why do you care what's going on in Savannah? I shook my head. Brandon may not know there's any connection between them, but from what I understand, he's back again. He's like a thief who robs your house and then comes back to rob it again. He owes me, and this time I'm going to do something about it. A concerned expression appeared on Bridget's face. John, what are you thinking? You're not going to do anything stupid, are you? Force has never solved anything. I didn't say that to Bridget, but as a historian, I knew that old saying wasn't true. You think force never solved anything? Tell that to the Carthaginians after Cato forced the Romans to subdue their army, slaughter all the men, enslave the women, and cover the fields with salt so nothing would grow on them for 7 years. This, it seemed to me, would quite settle the Carthage question. But I didn't want to alarm Bridget, so I only said, I don't know what I'll do, but I can't stand by and watch it happen. Now that Brandon Hilton's whereabouts were no longer a mystery, my mood only worsened. The possibility of revenge was no longer a fantasy. Now I was faced with the dilemma of what to do. I had always believed in the law. As a historian, I knew all too well what happens when people take their thirst for revenge into their own hands. But after what happened to me and my family, I just couldn't sit back and let this man go unpunished. My pride, my honor, and my sense of justice demanded an answer. Brandon Hilton had to pay for what he had done. Finally, after a long sleepless night, I made my decision. Having made it, I found that I could devise a plan to gain satisfaction. I didn't have much time, but I figured I could do what needed to be done if I hurried. Now I started using the internet to research the steps I would need to take and get the resources I needed to accomplish my goal. One by one, I found them. During this time, I was often away from home on business, but I hoped that taking care of 2 little ones would distract the others enough that they wouldn't notice how busy I was. The last thing I needed was a lot of questions and doubts. But both Emily and Bridget knew how to read my moods, and eventually, shortly before D-Day, as I called it, they confronted me. I was working at my computer one evening and looked up to see Emily standing on the doorstep of my office with a concerned expression on her face. Hey, babe, I said lightly. How's it going? Bridget's here, she told me. We need to talk to you. This was unusual. I hadn't planned on seeing Bridget tonight. I quickly closed the web browser and started to get up when Bridget walked through the door. She wasn't smiling. Before I could say anything, Emily spoke up. Dad, Bridget told me you found Brandon. I threw Bridget a lewd look, but she just folded her arms across her chest and stared at me with a determined expression. Emily continued. Daddy, I'm scared to death that you're going to do something crazy. I know how upset you are about everything that's happened, and you have every right to be. But if you end up in jail or ruin yourself, it will only make things worse. And then Bridget walked over and put her hand on Emily's shoulder. Please, John, Emily is right. Whatever you're up to, don't do it. I've already lost one person. I won't survive if it happens again. I saw the tears in their eyes, and in that moment I was tempted to forget my plans. These 2 women I loved more than anything in the world, and the last thing I wanted to do was hurt them. But I just couldn't call it off. A line from one of the Cavalier poets flashed through my mind. I could not love you, my dear, so much if I did not love you more than honor. I walked around my desk and hugged them both. Thank you for caring about me. It means a lot. But you're both worried about nothing, I tried to reassure them. I'm not going to do anything stupid. You know me better than that. Emily raised hopeful eyes to me. Promise, Daddy. I remembered that Emily was a little girl and held out my pinky finger to her. Pinky promise, baby, I swore, and she took my finger with hers and smiled. But there was a flicker of doubt in Bridget's eyes, and I realized I hadn't fooled her. I guess losing a husband in battle has that effect on a woman. I'd have to be careful not to scare her into trying to stop me. I thought I did a pretty good job of calming Emily down, but my efforts nearly went to waste when she picked up a package from the delivery service while I was still at school. When I got home, she held the box out to me with a concerned look on her face. "What's this, Daddy?" "The package says it's from the armory. It's heavy." I knew immediately what it was. I'd ordered it a long time ago and was worried if it would arrive in time. "Nothing special, babe. Just a gift for a colleague in the history department," I lied. She didn't say anything else, but I could see the doubt on her face. That evening, I was sitting in my office double-checking the driving directions diagram when Lori startled me by entering the room and closing the door. I'd made it clear that I wasn't happy to have her and her baby in our house, and so far she'd kept her distance. "Well, what do you want?" I asked coldly. For a while, she just stared at me, then her face turned red and she began to cry. "I know I've hurt you, been unfaithful, made you suffer, and—" She stopped to suppress a sob. "And I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but—" She had to pause again before she could continue. "Just, please don't hurt yourself or go to jail or anything because of me. I've done enough for you. I just can't bear to cause any more pain to you, or Emily, or even Bridget." I sat still. "That's your trouble, Lori. You always think it's all about you. But it's not about you, it's about me. I'm doing what I have to do. You're out of my life and you can't come back into it now or in the future. Do you understand?" Her face went pale, then she turned and walked quickly away. After thinking for a bit, I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a copy of the wedding announcement in the Savannah Morning News. I folded it up and put it in an envelope, then gathered the essentials. Tomorrow was D-Day, and I wanted to get an early start. Waking up early in the morning, I showered, shaved, grabbed my things, and tiptoed into the kitchen to get breakfast before heading out. I was just finishing my second cup of coffee when Emily walked into the room with the baby in her arms. She immediately noticed my suitcase and looked at me questioningly. "Where are you going, Daddy?" She asked anxiously. "I'll be back late tonight or early tomorrow morning, baby," I told her. "Where are you going?" She asked again, and I could see her anxiety growing. "It's okay, baby, I promise." "It's going to be okay," I told her, kissing both her and the baby on the forehead. Before she could speak, I reached into my pocket and handed her the envelope I had sealed last night. "Do me a favor, babe. When Lori gets home from work this afternoon, please give this to her." There was real fear in her eyes, but before she could say anything else, the baby started crying. And while she attended to him, I took that opportunity to slip out the door. As I pulled out of the driveway, I wondered if Emily would wait for Lori to return before reading the announcement. That made me wonder, so I reached into my pocket and turned off my cell phone. I didn't feel like talking to anyone until I did what I had to do. It's about a 4-hour drive from Atlanta to Savannah, so I reached the city a little after noon. After eating a fast food lunch, I stopped at a cheap motel to rest and change. After all, I wanted to look good for the wedding. It was still spring, but it was already hot and humid in Savannah. There was a breeze coming off the ocean, of course, but it did little to lower the temperature. I wore the dark wool suit I had brought with me. It was unremarkable, but acceptable for a wedding. It was fine with me. I didn't want to be noticed, at least not right now. The air conditioning in the car maintained a comfortable temperature during the drive to the cathedral, but as soon as I parked and started walking to the cathedral entrance, I was sweating. I checked to make sure my jacket was buttoned. The wedding was invitation only, but no one ever checked the guest list. I waited for a group of guests to come up the steps and joined them. I even made idle conversation with one couple while we waited for the stewards to escort the ladies to the pews. When asked, I said I wanted to sit on the bride's side, not because I didn't care for the Carlton family, but because there were more people sitting on that side of the aisle. Best disguise, I thought. The cathedral was a beautiful place for a wedding. The high top of the nave was impressive and the altar was strewn with lilies and white roses. The bride was beautiful in her long white dress as she walked down the aisle under the arm of her father. This old lecher was looking out at the congregation. I made sure to turn away as he passed my pew. The wedding mass was traditional. The priest even asked if anyone present knew of any reasons why a couple in love shouldn't get married. I was tempted to speak up, but I held back. The atmosphere was inappropriate for what I was about to do. After the wedding, the entire congregation went to the country club for the reception. I waited until most of the parking lot was clear and followed, not wanting to stand out. The reception was held in the club's main dining room. Rectangular tables were arranged in rows along one wall, forming an oblong main table. The rest of the room was filled with round tables, each large enough to seat 8 people. The tables were arranged in a semicircle to leave an open area for dancing. I estimated that there were 60 tables in the room. I would have a good audience for the performance. I found an unoccupied table at the back of the room and sat down. Must be employees or distant relatives, I thought. The other exiles at the table were glad for the company, and we struck up a leisurely conversation about the wedding, the reception, and how much Rufus must have spent. It must have cost him a fortune, one woman told me breathlessly. He hired Paula Dean to organize everything. I believed her. The food was delicious. If this is going to be my last dinner, I thought, at least it should be enjoyable. After dinner, the wine glasses were removed and replaced with champagne flutes. I knew what this portended, and my stomach tensed. At dinner, I only drank wine by the sip because I wanted to have a steady hand. But I did take the champagne flute, not to drink, but as a prop to help me prepare for the performance. The sound of Rufus Carlton's meaty finger tapping on the microphone drew our collective attention to the main table. After a few enthusiastic words about his daughter and her new husband, Rufus opened the microphone for toasts. He was followed by a procession of friends and family, each of whom felt it their duty to share some mildly humorous anecdote about the bride or groom. Each toast was followed by laughter, applause, and more alcohol. As the ritual dragged on, I stood up and moved across the room to the main table. After a few more offerings, things began to quiet down, and the best man, as I had hoped, asked, "Anyone else want a drink?" I raised my glass and exclaimed loudly, "I have a toast." Since I was standing off to the side, it was hard for most of those seated at the head table to see me. I didn't think there were many people in the audience who might recognize me, but I didn't want to take any chances. As I climbed up onto the platform behind the honored guests at the head table, I saw that most of the audience wasn't paying any attention to me. That's about to change, I thought grimly. I took the microphone and cleared my throat loudly. I wanted to get people's attention, but my throat was suddenly dry anyway. It was time to get started. We've heard a lot of anecdotes about the past today, but I want to talk about Mr. and Mrs. Hilton's future, I said in a falsely upbeat tone. By future, I mean children, of course. This elicited laughter and a few cheers of approval from the crowd. I predict that this couple will have many children in the future, I continued. I can't speak for Cecily, but I can definitely vouch for Brandon's abilities in that area. A few more chuckles broke out, but a slight murmur went up in the audience, and I noticed a few people looking at each other questioningly. I spoke a little louder. I can say that with certainty because Brandon has already fathered at least 2 children that I know of. I heard Mrs. Carlton sigh, and immediately a murmur swept through the audience. Rufus Carlton turned to look at me point blank, and suddenly his face lit up with recognition. "You are John Manning. You weren't invited to the wedding. Get off the stage." Brandon was sitting next to the platform in a state of mild intoxication, but when he heard my name, something must have caught his attention and he started to rise. I quickly leaned over, put my hand on his shoulder, and roughly pushed him back into his seat. Some fidgety soul had turned off the microphone, but it didn't faze me. I'd taught freshman history to a class of 300 people in an auditorium, so I knew how to project my voice. "I have something to say," I said loudly. Rufus yelled again for someone to get me off the stage. To my right, a few young men, must be Brandon's friends, were trying to make their way through the tables to do just that. I was ready for it. I reached down, unbuttoned my jacket, and unzipped the left side to reveal the shoulder holster I was wearing. With my right hand, I pulled out a .357 Magnum with an 8-inch barrel and waved it in the direction of the advancing men. Shouts came from the hall, and the men hastily retreated. "Mr. Magnum, I want to say a few more words to you about Brandon Hilton," I said loudly, keeping my left hand on his shoulder. He looked up at me, and his eyes were as wide and white as the wedding cookies we were served for dessert. "Like I said, Brandon Hilton is already the father of at least 2 children," I continued. "Would you like to know from whom?" Turning to Rufus, I growled, "The first child is by your second daughter, Lori, and the second is by your granddaughter, Emily." I heard the bride scream and turned to her sternly. "That's right, Cecily," I shouted. "Brandon is the father of not only your sister's child, but your niece as well." The poor girl broke into sobs. I felt a little sorry for her because this girl had never been unkind to me. But I couldn't say the same for the rest of her family. I turned to Brandon again. You've always screwed around with whoever you wanted, other people's wives, and you've always gotten away with it, haven't you, Brandon? But not now. With those words, I stood up, grabbed Brandon by his curly blonde hair, and yanked him back. Simultaneously, I put the magnum on the podium, reached for the sheath under my jacket on my right side, and pulled out my Bowie knife. I wanted to make an impression, and a huge knife with a blade, as long as the barrel of the magnum, certainly succeeded. When he saw the Bowie knife in my hands, he instinctively raised his hand in an attempt to protect his face. This gave me the opportunity to take his hair. I pulled out a plastic bag and put a hair sample in it. This should be enough for a DNA test, I told him and the rest of the crowd. Realizing that I wasn't going to destroy it, the young man slumped down in his seat. Looking down, I saw a dark stain spreading across the crotch of his pants. But I wasn't done with him yet. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a stack of papers, and shoved them into his hands. Brandon Hilton, this is a legal notice that you are being sued to establish paternity for the child you fathered with Lori Carlton Manning. You are hereby summoned to appear in court. I reached into my jacket again and pulled out a second packet. Brandon Hilton, this is a legal notice to file a paternity suit regarding the child you are fathering with Emily Manning. You are receiving notice. I looked at him in disgust. Don't even think about trying to disappear again. I've already notified the Georgia Department of Child Welfare. They have their own thing about deadbeat dads, and as soon as the court dockets the case, they'll come and collect from you wherever you go. I jerked his head up again. You want to predict your future, Brandon? I predict that for the next 18 years or so, you're going to do very little except work to pay child support for your kids. With those words, I walked up the table to the main floor. But before I left, I turned to the old man. He was looking at me with a mixture of hatred and despair. Congratulations on your new son-in-law, Rufus, I told him with a chuckle. You certainly are an excellent judge of character. There was a primal scream of some sort behind me, and I looked over my shoulder to see Brandon grabbing the massive pistol I'd left on the podium. He raised it, took aim at me, and began frantically pulling the trigger. I shook my head. Don't try to shoot me in the back, Brandon. That's not a real gun. It's a replica of one. Then I laughed. Why don't you keep it? Consider it my wedding present. With those words, I headed for the door as the commotion behind me reached hysterical levels. People in the hall were yelling at each other. Cecily and her mother were sobbing in each other's arms, and Rufus was yelling at Brandon. At that moment, in a strange but surprisingly appropriate decision, the orchestra leader raised his baton and ordered the musicians to play. I smiled as I walked out the door. Too bad they didn't play Closer to You, My God, I thought to myself. That would have been the perfect ending to this shipwreck. In all the commotion, no one followed me. Or maybe it was the memory of Bowie's knife still dangling from my belt. Whatever the case, I managed to get to my car and drive away without further incident. As I pulled onto the freeway heading north, the adrenaline began to wear off and I started to shake. Then, a tremendous fatigue came over me. I thought about pulling over and getting some sleep, but it was more important for me to get home. I didn't want to get arrested anywhere near Savannah. I rolled down the car windows to let the cool night air blow over my face and keep me awake. As I drove, I thought about what I had decided to do. If I destroyed Brandon Hilton, I would end up in jail and leave my family destitute. In addition, I would deprive the two little ones of the child support that Hilton would soon have to start paying. I guess in a way I became a kind of vigilante, but I did it in my own way, within the confines of the law. I took a certain satisfaction from Brandon Hilton. I made sure he paid for what he had done and would continue to pay until both children were adults. My daughter could definitely use the money to raise little Bridget, and with any luck, the extra income would help Lori leave my house sooner. Besides, I'd managed to get revenge on Rufus Carlton, and if my little prank caused him to spend a lot of money on a fancy wedding, that would be gravy, I thought. Whatever happened, I felt good, like a heavy weight had been lifted off my back. It was well past midnight when I finally made it to our neighborhood in Atlanta. I was going to be very quiet so as not to wake anyone up, but as I pulled into the driveway, the lights on the main floor were already on. As I started up the driveway, the door swung open and Bridget, Emily, and even Lori came running out with tears in her eyes. Emily was the first to reach me and fell into my arms, sobbing. "Oh, Daddy, I was so scared." Bridget then caught up with me. "Don't ever do anything so crazy again, John Manning. What if they had attacked you? What if someone had brought a gun? I took them both under my arms and led them back into the house. Both women wouldn't let go of me, and all three of us collapsed on the couch in exhaustion. When Bridget felt the sheath resting against her side, she made me pull out the Bowie knife and show it to her along with a bag full of Brandon's hair. "I can't believe you took that thing with you," she exclaimed. She then looked at me perplexed. "You do know that hair doesn't count as hard evidence, right?" she asked. "I know," I answered. "The court will order him to provide a new sample for trial, but it was a lot of fun to get this one, and it certainly convinced everyone here that I was right. Besides, it scared Brandon to death, literally." And then a thought hit me. "How do you all know what happened there?" "I told them," Lori said quietly. "Cecily called me and told me what happened." "Cecily called you? You haven't talked to her in years," I said incredulously. "I know," Lori said, "but she had to call me to find out if what you said about Brandon was really true. When I told her everything that had happened, she said she was going to start seeking an annulment tomorrow." I nodded. I was glad to hear that news. Tears were still streaming down Lori's face. "I know you didn't do it for me, John, but thank you for saving Cecily from that monster. It's going to be really hard on her for a while, but at least she'll know the truth now instead of later. Thank you for saving my little sister." I nodded again. I had done what I had done for my own reasons, but I still felt good knowing that Cecily's life wouldn't be ruined by that immoral bastard. Despite my misgivings, the police never showed up at our house that night or the next day. I thought Rufus would come after me, but apparently he directed his anger at Brandon instead. That young man's life was going downhill fast. Just as she had told Lori, Cecily had gotten her wedding annulled, on the grounds that Brandon had withheld important information from her. Meanwhile, at the trial of the two paternity suits I filed, the court ruled that he was indeed the father of Lori and Emily's children, and awarded both women appropriate child support. By registering his vital statistics with the Georgia Division of Child Support Services, Brandon Hilton became a marked man. The wedding reception became the sensation of the year, and although the guest list numbered only 500, thousands of Savannah residents claimed to have witnessed the fiasco. Not surprisingly, Brandon left town shortly afterward. I heard that he now holds a modest position in Macon's city government. What really surprised me was that Rufus Carlton apparently helped him get the job. I guess Rufus decided that the fact that Brandon had a job was in the best interest of all concerned. Of course, after paying 2 monthly alimony payments, Brandon didn't have much spare money left. Cecily and Lori kept in touch with each other, and eventually, Lori moved back to Savannah. I think Rufus was ready to welcome her back into the family without me. Or maybe he realized that banishing his daughter wasn't such a wise decision. Either way, her leaving was a relief to me. After everything that happened, I wish I could say I forgave her. But that would be a lie. And I was glad she was out of my life. Emily still lives at home, but wants to find her own place soon. She has found a good job here in Atlanta and is taking classes in the evenings to get her college degree. She has also recovered enough to start rebuilding her social life. Being a single mom isn't easy, but Bridget and I enjoy babysitting, and that helps. Yes, Bridget and I were married in a small private ceremony. She told me after my vigilante adventure that she wasn't going to let me out of her sight, so I decided to accept the inevitable and make it legal. Now that my personal Avengers excursion is over, I've decided to write a book on the subject. Hopefully, my future interactions with those who want to take the law into their own hands will only be academic in nature. However, it seems there is still one potential vigilante left in my life. My new wife took the Bowie knife, framed it, and hung it above our fireplace. She explicitly warned me that if I ever pulled such a damn stupid stunt again, she would take it down and perform an operation I would never forget. I think she's joking, but I don't intend to risk finding out. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.